very warm welcome. My name's David Roth and I'm the CEO of the store WPP and Chairman of BAV. And it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to Follow the Sun, 24 hours of broadcasting right across the world, to celebrate the launch of the WPP BAV Best Countries study for 2022, produced in conjunction with the US News and Wharton Business School. It's a pleasure to have you join us for this session. This broadcast is going to travel right across the world, starting in New Zealand and ending 24 hours later in the USA. We have an absolutely packed broadcast today. This year's Best Countries study is our fullest and most comprehensive yet. The attitudes of global business leaders, opinion formers, and citizens towards nation strengths has changed dramatically in recent years, never more so than in 2022. And we'll be looking at how those changes in values have impacted overall perceptions of our 85 nations covered in the 2022 study. But perceptions of a country only tell half the story. We'll then visit 24 countries to hear what's happening from WPP experts on the ground, and sometimes how perceptions of a country don't really reflect the situation. Now, our time together promises to be informative, challenging, stimulating, and I hope fun. So let's get started. How a country is viewed around the world is of huge importance, politically, economically, and socially. It has the ability to contribute to both a nation's hard and soft power. The Romans understood this well. SPQR, an abbreviation for Centanus Populosque Romanus, was arguably the first country branding. It was an emblematic, abbreviated phrase referring to the government of the ancient Roman Republic. You only needed to see the emblem, and invaded countries knew exactly what was in store for them. So country branding itself is not new, but measuring it is. Now in our 7th year, the WPP BAV Annual Best Countries Rankings measures global perceptions of countries against a series of characteristics, impressions that have the potential to drive trade, travel and investment. They also directly affect brands. The study was developed by WPP BAV, the Wharton Business School of the University of Pennsylvania, and US News. The ranking is based on a large global survey which asks a range of people about how they perceive different countries against a range of key attributes. Country branding also has a significant impact on corporate and product brands. The words "made in" can instantly lend credibility and trust to a product or brand that a consumer hasn't previously encountered. That could be enough to convince someone to buy, and beyond that, convince them to pay a premium. Likewise, "made in" can prove an instant turn-off if a consumer associates the country of origin with poor safety standards or sees it as being behind the times on social issues or workers' rights. But it's not just a one-way reaction. The perceptions and performance of brands abroad feed back into the development of the country itself. Additionally, willingness for corporates to invest vital FDI is also closely linked to the strength of a country's brand. As local brands and businesses succeed, they generate economic growth as well as lending further positive associations to their country's brand. There's a close relationship between how people feel about a country and their attitudes towards the brand they associate with that country. Strong countries fuel strong brands and vice versa. Think of France and Chanel. Both represent elegance, glamour and prestige. Chanel is intrinsically French, and France is synonymous with Chanel. The same can be said of Italy and Ferrari, or Japan and Sony. In each case, brands and the countries are part of a virtuous circle, a symbiotic relationship. In fact, Germany is a really fine example of this symbiosis in action. Germany has come to represent the qualities of durability and engineering that brands like Bosch, BMW, Audi and Mercedes have shown the world that Germany can deliver. Brands can both shape and be shaped by the perceptions of their country of origins. Japan in the 1970s was known as a cheap manufacturing base, but now respected as a world leader for quality electronics and also technology, thanks largely to brands like Sony and Toyota. South Korea has taken a similar path, with Samsung and Hyundai demonstrating to the entire world what modern South Korea is and is doing, so creating consumer predisposition in international markets that favour other South Korean brands. There's a two-way reaction and a multiplier effect for both. This year's study quantifies the impact. We see that 83% of consumers globally agree that consumer brands play an important role in defining a country's culture. 78% also agree that the country a product is made in impacts my preference to purchase it. Our annual Best Countries ranking was first launched in 2016 at the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, the world's largest gathering of global leaders and heads of industry and influence. It's now in its 7th year, and given how turbulent the past 7 years have been across the globe, enables us to see the impact of the changes. The Best Country ranking incorporates the views of close to 18,000 individual members of the public and business decision makers, surveyed in 85 countries across the world. This year's survey was completed in mid-2022. Collectively, the 85 countries in the 2022 rankings account for about 95% of global gross domestic product per capita and represent 80% of the world's population. Individuals surveyed for Best Countries were asked how closely they associated 73 attributes with a range of countries. These attributes were then grouped into 10 categories that were used to calculate the Best Countries ranking, and more on those attributes later. So come with me as we meet our first guests on our interview stage. Well, I'm very delighted now to be joined by Lord Jim O'Neill, the former Chief Economist of Goldman Sachs and a former government UK Minister and Chairman of Chatham House. Jim, Lord O'Neill, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
President Zelensky has said that the price we have to pay for avoiding a third world war is going to be higher energy bills, increases in the cost of living, and a reduction in living standards. And this comes at a time where we see from our BAV Best Countries study that softer values, sort of like quality of life and social purpose, are much more important in defining a nation's brand. But do you think that public opinion at the moment will pressurise governments to hold their current policies, or do you think they will start to look at alternatives?
Nice, easy question that you start with. I don't know, because it is probably for my generation, never mind the younger generation, the first such issue of this scale and complexity that we've seen. So far, it appears Western nations, who are the prime supporters of Ukraine, of course, have been happy to support the government stance on Ukraine, and superficially accept the cost, which is essentially this enormous cost of living shock. But it remains to be seen how that passes the test of time. So as we're seeing here, the government itself is almost definitely going to have to pay for the cost of this dilemma. I can't help finishing my answer to this very tricky question by also pointing out that if we really want to be serious about climate change and alternative energies, having a permanently higher price for carbon emitting energy forms is probably ultimately the sort of thing that is needed. One would imagine accelerate the desire for alternative energies to become more and more part of everyday life.
Now, you were chairman of the Chatham House, one of the world's leading think tanks. Its mission of a world that is sustainable, secure and prosperous is great. What do you feel, how far are we from realising that goal?
Isn't and hasn't really worked the way it's supposed to do on the tin.
So Jim, what should the priorities of nations be then now?
Yeah, so to what should we do about it? You know, I've become linked to a number of things I've been involved in, a big believer in what I broadly call profit with purpose. And we need to have business itself think more about the societal remit of who ultimately they serve. We've lived in an era, and still do, of where the only thing that matters for many, certainly publicly quoted business, is the shareholder. And it's not enough. And private business shouldn't be rewarded if we don't have productivity that goes with these big gains for them. And policymakers need to be more alert to the realities of life rather than just what was in economic textbooks of the 1960s and 70s. And if we don't learn from that, I have a fear that some of the dilemmas that have just blown up dramatically in the past few years out of nowhere could actually get worse.
Now, we started with a hard question, so let's end with an easy one. Lord O'Neill, are you an optimist or a pessimist given the situation we see around the world today?
Right now, I feel a lot more pessimistic than I've done for a long time. However, that said, I've been around the policy area in many different forms for over 40 years, and I've lived through a lot of crises. And the one thing I know for sure is that the crisis you're in, even though it often seems the worst you've ever been through, they come to an end. And one of the big things I've learned is never let a crisis go to waste. And indeed, the making of a business, a leader, or of a country is how they respond to the crisis you are in, because it normally defines how you're going to deal with the future era. So in that sense, there are lots of ways of things that could emerge from all of this mess in a more positive way.
Well, Lord Jim O'Neill, ending on a slightly more positive note than we started, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been a privilege to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me joining you.
As we travel around the world together in our Follow the Sun broadcast, we'll be hearing news, views and insights from local WPP company colleagues in 24 of the 85 countries covered in the WPP BAV Best Countries study for 2022. Now, before we go to one of those countries, let's remind ourselves of the WPP BAV Best Countries 2022 rankings from the 85th down to the number 1 country. let's see what the overall findings of Best Countries 2022 are before we go to Vietnam for local insights from the WPP team. And don't forget to download the Best Countries Metaverse experience for even more global insights from the address on your screen. Historically, military power and finance, banks and tanks were the attributes against which we measured a country's power in the world. Not anymore. So what does all this mean? It shows that a nation focused on providing great quality of life for its people, which cares about the rights and equality, and has a focus on entrepreneurship, is seen as having the most powerful nation brand. This reflects a world today and the factors that influence public perceptions and consumer decision-making, and by implication, a nation's political policy making. So let's take a look at those 10 factors and their weights for 2022. Entrepreneurship, 14.2%. Cultural influence, 10.4%. Power, 5%. Heritage, 3.1%. Adventure, 5.5%. Quality of life, 14.5%. Open for business, 9.3%. Social purpose, 13.5%. Agility, 14%. Movers, 10.6%. So it's clearly no longer just tanks and banks that give a country influence around the world. Softer power, which comes about as a result of entrepreneurship and cultural exports, is increasingly making an impact.
But speaking of, all this craziness, how would you describe overall the Vietnam's business landscape these days?
I would say that we just wrapped up a very good Q3 for this year. So the GDP of the nation actually rises to 13.67%. And it's the first time in the last 2 years that we see a positive growth. And also, especially on the manufacturing front, Vietnam is definitely open for business. We see a flurry of high-tech companies like Apple's moving to Vietnam. You know what? We're actually producing Apple Watches right now, and also MacBooks. Yes. So not only that, like we see Intel, Samsung, LG following the lead of Apple. And I think that's great news for the country. I would say that one of the biggest contributing factor for Vietnam is cheap manufacturing costs, and also the affordable business doing here. And how do you see it on the tourism front?
So, back in 2019, Vietnam was amongst, one of the 10 countries in the world with fastest tourism growth. But fortunately, due to pandemic, the tourism industry has some growth. But we are seeing some recovery now in the first 9 months of this year. The GSO has reported that we are actually welcoming about 2 million almost of international arrivals. So that's great news for inbound tourism. And overall, we see a lot of government efforts and support to increase inbound tourism. So things like issuing e-visas or visa-free stays to international visitors, all of it is in the works. And we also saw that the government has recently collaborated with TikTok for a promotional campaign, and we saw a lot of highlights of, the usual beautiful sides of Vietnam, but also of the amazing food here. That's one of the main draws of why people come to Vietnam is for the food, right? And it's not just the local food, but it's also, we've seen a lot of growth in international cuisines. So anything you can think of, like Mexican food, French food, American food. So all of those cuisines and Michelin star restaurants, you can find them in Vietnam.
Great. And I also saw that Vietjet has just opened a few new routes to India and Kazakhstan. So I'm just predicting that we are gonna receive a lot of international tourists in the next coming year.
So with so many people coming into the country, how do you see these international influences and dynamic changes in the country? How do you think the lifestyle overall is changing here?
So I would say that the lifestyle in Ho Chi Minh City and Hanoi are definitely getting more cosmopolitan. On the consumer front, people are spending more and more of their disposable income in traveling. It can be overseas travel or domestic travel. And also, like you just pointed out, a lot of the expenditure is now going into food and beverages. So people are going out again, people are traveling again. That's definitely a good marker of the positive recovery for the economy. On top of that, there are two categories that were just so silent and so dead during COVID. That was fitness and beauty and personal care category. And for the first time, people are spending, their money there again, and they're just actively getting back to a very fun and very cosmopolitan lifestyle in the two big cities in Vietnam. And I would say this is, for the first time, the consumer optimism and consumer confidence index in the city and in the country overall is increasing. And we're now the second most optimistic country in Southeast Asia.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I know. It's good to see smiles in the sunny land of Vietnam again, How would you say, how would you describe some of the happenings in the cultural scenes, cultural trends or any movements happening in Vietnam?
So this is a very exciting time to be here, and in part due to all the political and socioeconomic changes and in business that we've just talked about, and everything is changing so fast. And I think a lot of it is due to young people driving the change in the country. So Vietnam is truly a country of young change makers and the shakers and movers. So for example, we see that a lot of Vietnamese artists and Vietnamese art going global thanks to content platforms like YouTube or Netflix or Spotify, making Vietnamese artists more accessible to everybody around the world, really. We also see a lot of Vietnamese athletes competing on the global stage, both in traditional sports and now something more new like esports. And we see growing concern about the planet and young people really, driving this change. They're more vocal and they're taking action on social media platforms. They're speaking out about issues of sustainability, or they're starting new businesses, business ideas. Like a lot of people are opening plant-based restaurants, or maybe zero waste clothing brands.
Yeah, that trend is so happening, so lively.
And we see that there's been a lot of growing awareness for gender diversity and sexual orientation as well. So for instance, back in September, Hanoi just hosted a Pride event with support from the government, actually. So overall, we see a lot of changes and a lot of progress towards a more open-minded and inclusive cultural environment on multiple fronts.
choice. It's so exciting. Not only is Vietnam open for business, we see so many foreign brands, Vietnamese brands making their first exports into the world. And not only that, we also see changes on the consumer front. Everyone is being more active, giving their voice, taking part in movements. I would say that's a strong sign of a mover and shaker in Asia, don't you think? Wow, it's been a great conversation with you. It is lovely to talk about all these changes and exciting news for our country.
And thank you so much, Gwen, for your insights. Very great observations on the business and manufacturing firms.
Thanks for tuning in. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted now to be joined by Dr. Stacey Graham, who is the Global Racial Equity Program Director at WPP. Stacey, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
This year we see social purpose becoming significantly important, which is a good thing. Why do you think that's so?
I believe in the survey you define social purpose around a few categories such as caring about gender and racial equity, the environment, human rights, and so forth, right? And what we understand about humans is we have an innate desire to have a reason for being. That's another word for purpose. So I'd say if we look at what's happened in the world in the last 2.5, 3 years, that is definitely catapulted into the mainstream. We have all these things coming together that are pinpointing, illustrating how we're failing as a collective.
And do you think that failure as a collective is something that's now being exposed right across the globe?
Absolutely. I would say that even before 2020, we could see it happening, but there's something about a restriction of freedom of movement, right? That makes people sit at home and have nothing else to do but recognize and look into everything that's wrong with the world, if you will. And so I think that it's on people's minds. What does it mean to be in a collective when I'm sitting at home and can't leave my house anymore? What does it mean to really be connected as a society? How do we care for the most vulnerable? And to be really honest, with COVID-19, we didn't do a great job of that. So I think people are asking different questions than they were 2 to 3 years ago.
And I think I found it quite interesting to see the relationship between this movement, I mean, let's call it a movement, coming from the population upwards.
Absolutely. I mean, we also see that some of our health officials do move more politically than we would have expected. But there were people across the world who made the decision to wear a mask even when it was no longer mandated, who stayed at home even when they didn't want to, who got on the streets for probably the largest social movement since 1968, right? It was a global social movement to bring awareness to racial inequality. So I think there's a coming together even in times of divisiveness.
Now, one of the things we've seen in the study is this sort of interrelationship between a country's brand and companies' brands, and we're seeing that interrelationship even more sort of mingled and prevalent this year. So what should companies do to improve their social purpose in relation to how their country is seen?
That is a great question. I think that is something that they're still figuring out. But one thing we know for sure is people aren't simply incentivized by money. That's not enough to keep employees today. Employees want to work somewhere where they feel proud of not only the work that they do, but the things that the company stands for. They want to see their company standing up for social issues that they personally care about.
Stacey, why do you think suddenly companies are finding a political voice as opposed to purely a corporate voice?
I think to an extent, we have been able to observe this shift away. When I studied, there was a clear connection. The business strategy has to align with shareholder value. That's all we care about, maximizing shareholder value. And there was a notion that maximizing shareholder value stood in opposition to a social purpose, if you will. And today, I think people are recognizing that's actually not true. And we increase shareholder value when we can ensure that we have high employee engagement, low turnover, and people care about what they do in the company they work for.
Well, Stacey Graham, that's a fantastic place to stop. This whole topic is something that we are all going to have to understand a lot better, and not just understand it, but also ensure that it's actions as opposed to merely words. But for the moment, Dr. Stacey Graham, the Global Racial Equity Programs Director at WPP, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you.
Hello and a very warm welcome. My name's David Roth and I'm the CEO of the store WPP and Chairman of BAV. Thank you very much indeed for joining me in this very special metaverse experience, exploring the WPP BAV Best Countries 2022 study in conjunction with Wharton Business School and US News. Here we are in the arrivals hall, where you'll be able to discover the key insights from this year's study relating to global trends. Here you'll also find exclusive interviews with global experts and analysis of the data. And what a year we've had. There have been a lot of changes from last year. From here you can also go and visit the 85 countries that are ranked in this year's report. Each of those countries have their own individual room where you can explore a wealth of data and insights into each individual country. You might well see some surprises along your journey. And in the departure area, you can discover more about the study itself. Enjoy your trip around the BAV Best Countries 2022 Metaverse. Well, we're almost at the end of our broadcast. A big thanks to everybody from the local WPP companies who've participated, and of course our central team that's put together all of our Follow the Sun 24 hours of broadcasting, to our directors, to Tuin Dasgupta, to Paul Reifer, and our producers, Sarah Cousins and Lady Victoria Robinson. Well, all it's left for me, David Roth at WPP, to say thank you very much indeed for joining, and the next broadcast follows shortly on the hour.
you broke up with him first. Hey, your mama told me, Vic, don't go tearing up hearts. So come on, fight me like you always did from the start.